There are military organizations that build airplanes. There are defense contractors that win budgets, satisfy committees, and deliver machines that are eventually absorbed into the normal rhythm of procurement. And then there is the Skunk Works. It does not live in the same psychological world as ordinary aerospace design. It was born in urgency, raised in secrecy, and refined in a culture that treated bureaucracy almost as an enemy species. That is why, more than 80 years after its origins, the name still carries a kind of institutional menace. Not because every project succeeds, not because every rumor is true, but because the record shows that when the United States becomes convinced that something impossible must be built quickly, quietly, and before anyone else can react, one model keeps reappearing. A tiny team, a hard deadline, minimal paperwork, ruthless technical focus, total compartmentalization. And then, years later, the world discovers that the future has already been flying overhead. That formula is what terrifies competitors. Not just the aircraft themselves, but the system that produces them. The mythology begins in the Second World War, but the real story starts with the problem. In 1943, the United States wanted a jet fighter, and wanted it fast. Germany had already shown where air warfare was heading. Lockheed assigned Clarence Kelly, Johnson, still young, still abrasive, still already famous for engineering brilliance, to respond. What followed set the template for everything that came later. Johnson and a hand-picked team began work before the formal contract even arrived. They operated in strict secrecy, away from the normal flow of the factory, in a makeshift facility so improvised that the official Skunk Works origin story still describes a rented circus tent beside a foul-smelling plastics plant. Out of that unlikely beginning came the XP-80, designed and built in 14.3 days, faster than required, and with a management style that ignored almost every peacetime instinct of a large corporation. That origin matters because it established the Skunk Works as more than a shop floor. It became a philosophy. Johnson understood something that entire ministries still struggle to admit. If a project is truly revolutionary, the normal machinery of oversight can kill it before physics ever gets the chance. Meetings multiply, reports expand, chains of approval lengthen, risk managers begin managing the possibility of embarrassment, rather than the possibility of strategic surprise. Johnson built a counter-system. His famous rules emphasized small teams, direct communication, ruthless responsibility, tight control of costs, and insulation from administrative drag. In simple terms, he tried to create an elite engineering raiding party inside a giant industrial state. That alone would have been significant. But the real reason the Skunk Works became feared is that its method kept working. The first great proof was not a fighter, but a spy plane. In the 1950s, American leaders needed to see inside the Soviet Union without starting a war. Satellites were not yet ready to solve the problem. Conventional aircraft were too vulnerable. The requirement was almost absurd. Build something that could fly so high that interception would be nearly impossible, while carrying cameras good enough to make the risk worthwhile. The Skunk Works answered with the U-2. It was not glamorous in the cinematic sense. It looked fragile, narrow, almost glider-like. But that is precisely the point. Skunk Works solutions are often terrifying because they are not built to satisfy aesthetic expectations or service prejudices. They are built around the mission with almost predatory indifference to everything else. The U-2 helped give Washington a view inside Soviet territory that intelligence agencies had never possessed before. It altered strategic calculations, exposed myths, and provided reconnaissance during some of the Cold War's most dangerous moments. Yet the deeper lesson was organizational. Once again, a small, highly empowered team had produced a machine that changed statecraft itself. The airplane mattered. The process mattered more. Governments around the world could study the U-2 and conclude that the United States had not simply built a good aircraft. It had built a hidden mechanism for rapidly converting existential fear into technological advantage. And then came the Blackbird. If the U-2 suggested that the Skunk Works could see farther than everyone else, the A-12 and SR-71 proved it could move faster than the kill chain built to stop it. By the early 1960s, Soviet air defenses had improved enough to make altitude alone an increasingly fragile shield. The U-2's invulnerability had already been shattered, so the requirement evolved. The next aircraft had to outrun the threat, survive punishing heat, and function at the edge of what the materials of the era could tolerate. This was not merely a design challenge, it was an argument with the possible. The Skunk Works answered with titanium, exotic fuels, radical shaping, and engineering compromises that would have crippled a more conventional program. The resulting aircraft flew above 70,000 feet and beyond Mach 3, a machine so extreme that even its routine operations seemed like an act of controlled technical violence. The SR-71 is often remembered now as an icon, a black dart of Cold War glamour, but that retrospective beauty can obscure how frightening its existence was in context. It told rival powers that the United States possessed a design culture capable of solving problems that ordinary development systems could barely define. Every Blackbird sortie carried an implicit message. If this is what they can admit exists, what are they not admitting? That question only became sharper with stealth. The F-117 was not the most beautiful aircraft ever built. In fact, it looked like an angular mathematical accident, a faceted shard cut from a theory rather than an Air Force tradition. But that ugliness was part of the threat. It announced that the Skunk Works was willing to abandon decades of aerodynamic orthodoxy in pursuit of a different kind of survivability. According to Air and Space Forces magazine, the program moved from design go-ahead to first flight in just 31 months, then to initial operational capability in 60, helped by a tiny Air Force oversight office, relative freedom from normal scrutiny, and extensive use of off-the-shelf components so engineers could focus on the real breakthrough, reducing radar signature. That detail is critical. The terrifying part of the F-117 story is not simply that stealth worked, it is that the Skunk Works fielded it with extraordinary speed. This was not a leisurely research exercise unfolding across decades of conference papers and public procurement battles. It was a secretive sprint. Ben Rich and his team exploited computation, practical engineering, and managerial installation to bring a laboratory concept into operational reality before most observers understood what had changed. Then, Desert Storm arrived, and the shock became visible. The world watched precision strikes over Baghdad and realized that an aircraft previously hidden from public view had already rewritten the opening grammar of modern air war. That is the Skunk Works pattern at its most unnerving. First, a strategic problem emerges. Then, behind layers of compartmentalization, a small group is allowed to attack it without the normal ceremonial waste of the defense world. The resulting system is often strange, occasionally unstable, usually expensive, but years ahead of what outsiders assumed was possible. And by the time the public sees proof, the real innovation cycle has already moved on. This is why the phrase, "still terrifies the world," is not empty drama. Nations do not fear a logo. They fear a demonstrated ability to generate discontinuity. Most great powers can fund weapons. Many can copy weapons. Some can improve weapons once they understand the design logic, but far fewer can repeatedly create the institutional conditions in which radical advances appear before doctrine, procurement culture, or rival intelligence services have adjusted. The Skunk Works model compresses time. It shortens the distance between idea, prototype, and strategic consequence. In military competition, that is one of the most dangerous advantages a state can possess. And the fear deepens because secrecy is not a decorative trait in this model. It is part of the engineering architecture. Lockheed Martin's own current Skunk Works page says, with remarkable bluntness, "Some of our most important work isn't in the headlines. By design." That sentence is more revealing than it first appears. It suggests that the visible legacy, however extraordinary, is only the public crust over a much larger body of classified effort. Outsiders are left to infer capability from fragments. A strange shape glimpsed over a test range. Budget lines that do not quite add up. Procurement decisions that imply unknown enabling systems. Sudden leaps in areas like low observability, autonomy, mission systems integration, and high-speed flight. In other words, the terror is partly epistemic. Rival states do not simply worry about what the Skunk Works has built. They worry about what they cannot measure. Uncertainty itself becomes a weapon. That uncertainty has always been one of America's quiet strategic assets. During the Cold War, Soviet planners had to account not only for known bombers and fighters, but for the possibility that some black program had already solved tomorrow's problem. Today, the same logic extends into a more complex landscape. Stealth is no longer novel in the way it was in 1983, but survivability has expanded beyond shape into materials, electronic warfare, mission networking, and software-defined adaptation. Lockheed's public language now emphasizes AI, autonomy, human-machine teaming, integrated systems, and, tellingly, things we can't talk about. Even the openly acknowledged X-59, a supersonic research aircraft built for NASA, serves as a reminder that the Skunk Works remains a place where unusual aerodynamic problems are still attacked by small, specialized teams. But hardware alone does not explain the lasting aura. The deeper reason the Skunk Works still unsettles the world is that it represents an answer to a question every military bureaucracy hates being asked. What if the real obstacle was never physics? What if the true limiter on breakthrough systems was process? What if entire generations of defense organizations have mistaken administrative complexity for seriousness? What if most delays presented as prudence are, in fact, accumulated cowardice? Institutional habits designed to spread blame rather than concentrate excellence. The Skunk Works legacy threatens not only foreign rivals, but bureaucratic orthodoxy itself, because it keeps implying that smaller teams with sharper authority and clearer purpose can outrun far larger systems burdened by their own rituals. Of course, that model has limits. Extreme secrecy can hide mistakes as well as achievements. Compartmentalization can distort oversight. Small elite teams can become insular. Not every problem can be solved by a handful of brilliant engineers operating at wartime tempo, and the modern defense environment is far more networked, software-heavy, regulated, and politically exposed than the world Kelly Johnson inhabited. It would be foolish to turn the Skunk Works into a religion, but it would be even more foolish to dismiss what its history demonstrates. Again and again, from the XP-80 to the U-2, from the Blackbird to the Nighthawk, the model produced systems that arrived early enough to shock adversaries and reframe strategy. Even its failures and dead ends were often failures at the edge of possibility, not failures of imagination. That matters. Great powers rarely dominate because they never make mistakes. They dominate because they can afford to explore regions of risk that others fear entering. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. The Skunk Works is not frightening because it is magical. It is frightening because it is methodical. Behind the legends, the black hangers, the desert secrecy, and the myth of genius and isolation, there is a brutally simple operating idea. Put exceptional people in the small room, define the mission clearly, cut away everything that does not help them solve it, and keep the world in the dark until the machine is real. There is also a human factor that makes the story more intimidating than the hardware alone. The best Skunk Works programs were built by people who accepted punishing tempo as normal. Lockheed's own historical account quotes Kelly Johnson's exhausted note during the race to prepare the U-2, airplane essentially completed. Terrifically long hours. Everybody almost dead. That line matters because it strips away the romance. These aircraft did not emerge from a frictionless cathedral of innovation. They came from pressure, fatigue, urgency, and the willingness to place extraordinary burdens on unusually capable people. Competitors do not merely see a sleek airframe at the end of the process. They see evidence that a rival state can still concentrate talent, money, secrecy, and national priority hard enough to make exhaustion productive. That culture leaves marks on the machines. Skunk Works aircraft often feel less like committee products, and more like concentrated arguments. The U-2 argued for altitude. The Blackbird argued for speed and thermal endurance. The F-117 argued for low observability, even at the expense of elegance. Every one of them was a hard-edged answer to a narrow problem. And because the answer was narrow, it could be revolutionary. This is another reason the organization has such a fearsome reputation. Bureaucracies tend to compromise early. The Skunk Works historically compromised late, after wringing as much mission advantage as possible from the original idea. That approach can create strange aircraft. It can also create historic overmatch. An overmatch has psychological effects far beyond combat statistics. When a rival planner believes an opponent may possess a hidden reconnaissance platform, a stealthier penetrator, a better mission system, or an autonomy architecture already tested in classified conditions, caution spreads through the entire decision chain. Air defense spending changes, procurement priorities shift, wargames become more pessimistic. Commanders assume there may be a capability they have not yet seen, which means deterrence begins operating before a single aircraft is publicly unveiled. In that sense, Skunk Works secrecy does not simply protect technology. It amplifies strategic imagination on the other side, forcing adversaries to budget against ghosts. This is why even the failures, cancellations, and rumors matter. In most organizations, a cancelled advanced aircraft is just a dead file and a budgetary lesson. In the Skunk Works universe, cancelled programs often become part of the mythology because outsiders assume that the visible loss may have generated invisible gain. The prototype dies, but a material process survives. A black program never enters service, but its avionics architecture migrates elsewhere. A demonstrator is rolled into a hangar, and decades later some detail of its logic reappears in an operational platform under a different name. That recycling of hidden knowledge makes the organization feel less like a sequence of projects and more like a continuous underground current in American air power. That formula has survived presidents, wars, technological revolutions, and entire generations of strategic fashion. It survived the propeller age, the jet age, the nuclear age, the stealth age, and now it is adapting to an era of autonomy, software, and systems fusion, which means the true legacy of the Skunk Works is not any single aircraft, however famous. It is the preservation of a national instrument for producing strategic surprise, and that is why the name still carries weight far beyond aviation circles. Somewhere in the American defense ecosystem, perhaps in full view, perhaps behind layers of access control and false designations, the same old pattern may be running again. A small team, a hidden requirement, a deadline no one outside the room fully understands, an aircraft or drone or sensor architecture that looks improbable until the day it abruptly isn't. For the rest of the world, that is the nightmare. Because the nightmare is not just one airplane. It is the possibility that while competitors debate procurement reforms, industrial policy, and next-generation concepts in public, a sealed compartment in the desert may already be turning those debates into obsolete paperwork. History suggests the most dangerous Skunk Works program is usually not the one museums can display. It is the one still hidden behind a false title, absorbing long hours, hard math, and the silence that always comes before revelation arrives anyway. Because if Skunk Works history teaches anything, it is this: by the time you know what they built, you are already living in the world it was designed to create.